As happens every year, this year's MPC will be reviewing the government performance and then listen to economic and policy targets set for the year. And also, deputies will be deliberating legislation. And then, as you mentioned, there's going to be a new lineup of leaders for China. So analysts are watching very closely if there will be any major policy shifts. For you, Mr. Eskelund, what are some of the major priorities for the new government? And what are some of the items on your list of concern?
Yeah. First of all, I think it's important for us to watch carefully and see, first of all, who it is that will be chosen to lead the country for the next 5 years. We've been waiting now for 5 months since the 20th Party Congress, and there's been a lot of speculation about who will be appointing to the leadership positions now, and today we will get clarity. I think there's also a lot of anticipation in regard to establishing clarity on what the political priorities will be going forward, in particular in regards to the economy. There is a sense of anticipation in the sense that China has finally now moved beyond COVID. There's a good momentum in the economy. We can see already now how will that be used and what will the agenda really be going forward from an economic perspective.
This concept of modernization was first outlined in the 20th National Congress of the Communist Party of China last October. What are some of the characteristics, Mr. Eskelund, of Chinese modernization, and how would you characterize this process?
I think it's a very rich agenda, and I think that was also reflected by the lineup that we saw, a very diverse group of people. So it is really focusing across a whole spectrum of issues when you talk about modernization. I think modernization is both in regards to creating a new ecological model that works for China, enhances quality of life, and which is really sustainable. I think we heard also a lot about self-reliance, that there are a lot of technologies that China will need to develop itself, not just in terms of China being able to protect itself from a technological perspective, but also because China now in many ways is at the vanguard of development. So, innovation will need to come from China. So a lot of interesting things going on right now as we see it, and we'll be watching it keenly, of course.
A lot of discussion is focusing on the future path of development for China. Whether China will be pursuing a more modest, more ambitious growth is something that the world is looking very closely at. Premier Li Keqiang will be delivering the government work report, and will be delivering his last government work report in just a moment. And of course, the key focus will be on the GDP growth. What are some of your expectations here, and how do you think that this goal will respond to market expectations? Mr. Eskelund.
First of all, GDP is important, and we of course have high expectations to China. China is rebounding now post-COVID. China is the world's second largest economy. So what happened in terms of growth in China is important for the world. However, I would like to reach back to something that the government has been reiterating before. Let's not stare blindly at a GDP number. It's about the quality of the GDP. We'd like to see more consumption-driven growth, for example. If it's all debt-fueled, fixed asset investment that may not generate a lot of long-term value, maybe it's not ideal. But if we really see Chinese consumers again coming out in force, spending, helping to drive the domestic economy, helping to drive imports also, I think that could be really, really significant. So I think we need to dig a little bit deeper and see where is the GDP growth going to come from. I think 2023 is going to be a good year. We see there's good momentum. I think what really that I'm focused on now is to see what is happening in the little bit longer term, 24, 25 and beyond.
Mr. Eskelund, let me follow up on that. Would you say consumption is the only base to boost the Chinese economy? Because eventually people need employment, need good well-being, welfare, so that they can live happily, and eventually they will be more willing to spend. So that means also the foundation of the economy should be strengthened. What do you make of this approach?
Yeah, but I think that's absolutely correct. People need to feel secure. If people don't feel secure in terms of their ability to find a job, in terms of their ability to access healthcare, people will not spend. So I think you need to establish that sort of basic feeling of safety in society. We've seen that many places in the world, and we don't have any reason to think it would be any different in China. So I think that would actually be quite powerful if we create that sense of security amongst people.
How do you read into this significance or this characteristic of the mechanism to have not only short-term planning, but also looking at longer goals to achieve?
I think from a business perspective, certainly we like long-term planning. We are doing long-term planning ourselves. We need the predictability, reliability, and stability that long-term planning provides. Then, of course, things happen, as we saw with COVID, where everything is being thrown up in the air. And that's really what I see now. It is what we are trying to reach for again. That is to find that long-term perspective. We have moved beyond an emergency situation, and now it's the time for us again to establish that stability, to establish that line of sight, so we know really what the future has in store for us. That is what gives investors confidence again. That is what gives consumers confidence to go out to spend. So it's important that we know what's coming further down the line, and I certainly have the expectation that we'll be a lot wiser during the course of today.
Mr. Eskelund, by saying we, I believe you're talking about the European Union business circle, right? Because I believe you listened to the MPC press conference yesterday, and one question was given to China-EU relations. What do you make of the momentum ahead?
I think there's an opportunity now. I think, let's be honest and say that China-EU relations are in a little bit of a tight spot for all sorts of geopolitical reasons, not least the fact that for the first time there's a major war going on in Europe for the first time in 75 years. But as my colleague said, I think it's so enormously important that people are able to meet again face to face. I think it cannot be exaggerated how important it is that we have Chinese people going to Europe and Europeans coming to China and get restarted on that dialogue. I think there's a wide range of global issues that we need to solve together that cannot be solved by one side alone. So let's get started. Let's meet each other and let's try to get cracking on some of these issues.
Gentlemen, talking about the achievements made by the Chinese government in the past 5 years, as we just heard from Premier Li Keqiang, poverty alleviation, eradication of absolute poverty in China is indeed a major one. Mr. Eskelund, what do you make of the international significance of this Chinese bid?
I think it was indeed significant what has happened to poverty alleviation, and I think also in a global perspective this is something that stands out as something that China has done really, really well. And I think everyone is looking at that in admiration, and I was also happy to hear that going forward that will continue to be a priority of the government, that you close the gap between rural and urban areas and also continue to seek to raise the floor for the incomes of the poorest. I also took note, and that's of course something that's very dear for us here in Beijing, about the air quality. And while today perhaps is not the bluest of days, I mean all of us who live here have certainly experienced how the air quality has improved significantly over the past 5 years. I think in the very near past there was a lot of focus on stability, economic stability, social stability, employment and price stability, and I think that has perhaps been defining for the past 1 or 2 years here during COVID. But in the longer 5 terms, definitely what has happened on poverty alleviation for me stands out as a really and true achievement of China.
Most of the items in that government work report has to do with domestic planning. But then, as you said, a lot of these policies also have global significance and global relevance. For example, it's major foreign policy outreach, BRI, and also the Global Development and Global Security Initiative. How do you read into how China's planning is synchronizing itself with the rest of the world?
Synchronizing, I think it is an interesting term to use, because the world, the rest of the world and China are so interdependent, and they are so integrated already. So I think we were never ever completely out of sync. We have seen how China has actually grown its trade here during COVID, and I think in 2022 China's total proportion of trade actually grew compared to what it was pre-COVID. But there are certain aspects, of course, that are out of balance, and I think that was also reflected in what the Premier said as a priority area. There is a need to boost domestic consumption. There is a need to address financial risk. Poverty alleviation needs to continue. So I think obviously the proof is in the pudding, and now we are looking forward to see what specifically does it mean when we talk about boosting domestic consumption and addressing financial risk, and that of course will come a little bit further down the line.
Yeah, sure.
Mr. Eskelund, talking about this year's priorities, I believe you notice this notion, attract and utilize foreign investment. What are your expectations in specific measures?
I think first of all, in the European Chamber of Commerce, we do feel that China is actually underinvested now. There's so much more we can do. And we hope that now that travel has become possible, that we will have that engagement that allow European companies to explore the opportunities. The year before last year, actually, European companies invested more in Texas than in all of China. Sweden invested the same amount of money in China as EU companies did. Now in the US as EU companies did in China. We don't think that's proportionate. We think there's much more we can do. And I think we need to sit down to find out how we can become better at utilizing the real investment potential available in China today.
Sector-wise, could you be a little bit more specific? Sector-wise,
I was actually encouraged to hear that in the work report that the services sector was specifically mentioned, because services has been one area where investment in China and also services as a proportion of the entire economy has actually been lagging a little bit behind the global average. So it'll be very interesting to see what areas of the services industries where opportunities will arise.
right?
Yeah. Some very ambitious goals in terms of employment. For example, last year the country provided 11 million jobs, and the unemployment rate is about 5.5%. And this year, the government is planning to create 12 million more jobs for the youth, and also the unemployment rate will be controlled to something around 5%. How do you look into that, and which sector has a role to play here?
Yeah. I think it's a very interesting discussion because, as you mentioned also, the labor force in China is becoming steadily more educated, better and better educated, many more young people going to universities. I think there's a certain risk. We see in some industries that there are beginnings of bottlenecks because it's actually getting pretty hard to get educated, skilled workers. And I think one focus area needs to be on how do you make sure that the labor market actually fits the need of the real economy. And I think maybe we need to talk a little bit more about, how do we make it more prestigious to be a really good skilled worker. I think in many European countries, it's not necessarily the be all, end all that you have a university education. And I think we need to create that respect for skilled workers to make it attractive to get into these areas of economies where there are bottlenecks presently.
So as we heard in the government work report, there's a very strong focus on innovation, and that's also part of China's drive to achieve high quality growth and along its process of modernization. I want to get some thoughts from our guests here. How do you think that the government is trying to pursue that modernization drive through innovation? Because we understand China has a relatively high investment in R&D. How can the government further boost investment in that regard and to translate those technologies into practices in our daily lives?
I think China is doing tremendously well when it comes to innovation and modernizing its industries and manufacturing. China has today some of the world's most complex supply chains. And I think it's important that there is a continued focus on making sure that these very complex, advanced supply chains are anchored here in China. There's a lot of talk about decoupling. There's a lot of talk about de-risking, and those are some of the things that perhaps over time can come to impact these supply chains that are such an important drivers for innovation. So I think it's important that we have open discussions about how we can allay some of these concerns, so we can continue to develop on some of these very, very impressive supply chains that have been here. And then, of course, I think it's right when the government goes out and says that there needs to be a higher focus in China on doing basic research. These are some of the things that perhaps are only delivering results in 20 or 30 years in terms of things that consumers can use, but it is really in sort of the very basic research that you lay the foundation for what is going to come later on. And then again, let's get back to have a truly international research environment. That's something that we can all invest in now, making sure that we have this cross-fertilization between China and overseas research institutions, persons, companies, and so on.
Mr. Eskelund, do you think China's green transformation will also provide opportunities to the world?
Absolutely. It is one of these areas that we in the business community, European business community, find most promising, and where I think there are very significant European and Chinese complementarities in what we can bring to the table. The Chinese engineering prowess is very well known, and I think that a lot of European companies will be looking to China to co-develop solutions to deliver on the green ambitions. I think it's also very important that China, Europe, and the rest of the world, they sit down together and try to work out what should the future standards be. We cannot have a world where we go out and develop multiple different standards, because that will make trade impossible. So let's be really, really ambitious, and let's also be very collaborative and then work on this. This is, for mankind, it's an existential challenge that we have in front of us, that we cannot afford to let politics really get in the way.
Right, and talking about goods trade, do you think China-Europe trade will keep a stable momentum this year?
What we have seen pre-COVID, every time Europe imported one container, China exported 2.5 containers to Europe. That discrepancy has actually increased. It's almost 4 containers being exported from China to Europe, and when Europe exports one to China, that's a very significant imbalance. We hope, of course, now with the opening up, and when the confidence comes back in the economy, and when people begin to spend again, that there will be a more balance in the trade relationship. Unfortunately, if these big discrepancies are not addressed, then there is, of course, a risk that it can become a political issue also, and that's what we all want to avoid. So now we hope that the consumer will step up, and with the new activity coming in the economy, will also begin to improve on some of these import figures.
So what kind of goods is Europe willing to offer?
I think we are almost over the entire consumer palette, and also machinery. I mean, whether it's food, wine, cars, machinery, high value added goods. So the products are there, and Europe is doing pretty well in terms of exports to the rest of the world. But we seem to have a little bit of catching up to do in terms of exporting into China.
Yeah, and the Minister of Industry and Information Technology mentioned that China is aiming to drive up its industrial production, to upgrade its industrial value addedness. It says that traditional industry takes about 80% of overall industrial capacity. How is that end going to be addressed?
First of all, I think we should recognize that when it comes to manufacturing and product quality, China is doing very, very well. China exports more than 1/3 of global manufactured goods. So China has an enormous role in this. I think the challenge for China ahead is that China needs to grow productivity, because growing productivity is what will help address demographic challenges, it is what will allow salaries to come up, which in turn will help to boost domestic consumption. So I think the productivity part is something that really needs some focus. But China is very, very good at manufacturing. I would say, world champion actually in this respect. But it's a continuous effort, and China needs to continue to invest in particular in the productivity aspect. Private sector is very important there. We see that the way that the private sector utilizes capital tends to be more efficient, and I think also the international aspect, because sometimes you would need to look outside the borders to find the technology that allows you to create that productivity growth. So that would be where I would suggest to focus.
Mr. Eskelund, I'd like to catch up on China's going green effort. We know Nordic countries have been global pioneers in going green. So give us a sense of the potential of cooperation between China and the rest of the world, and of course Nordic countries.
Yeah. It is very, very significant, and I see it, and again, I see Europe and China as being highly, highly complementary in many respects. Europe has some of the most ambitious target sets for the decarbonization, and China needs to be a part of that for the engineering, for the manufacturing of whether it's solar panels or green fuels or electric vehicles and all that. And I think also at the same time, a lot of the important work going on in Europe on standards is something where we need to make sure that we align, we exchange experiences, and we collaborate. This is one area where definitely there can be no talk of decoupling. We need to do this together, and also recognize that Europe and China both have very significant strengths that we need to bring into play. The sum is more than its parts when it comes to this aspect here, and we should recognize that.